Today, let's walk through the steps of making a quilted tote bag. Welcome, I do sewing and DIY related content, and today we are using these two quilt blocks and we are going to be making a quilted tote bag. So fun fact, these were actually made by my mom a while ago. I learned to sew from her and she had decided at one point she wanted to try to learn to quilt. She never did anything with them, but today we are going to turn them into a quilted tote bag as part of her Mother's Day gift. So by the time this video comes out, she will have already seen this. It will not be a surprise anymore. But the first step that I needed to do was sort of fix one of these quilt blocks. So this is actually, I feel like it happens to me all the time with quilt blocks. They can just get a little bit almost puckered if they're too tight. So to really make sure that it lays nice and flat for our quilt tote bag, I'm going to go through and just extend a little bit of the seam allowance. So if this happens to you, you could definitely just extend the seam allowance so that it's a little bit easier for it all to lay together. Once I had that done though, I just went over to my sewing machine and then just redid that stitch. Everything that you've seen in all of my videos, she's even been included in some of the pictures on Instagram or that I use on YouTube. I really learned a lot of my sewing from my mom, so I wanted to make her something really fun for Mother's Day, which would be this tote bag. Once I had that done, I had my two quilt blocks ready to go. I did press them all out so that they were nice and smooth. And then I'm going to be using this green as a border around the quilt blocks, and then it will also be the lining. Now for this, I just cut out a strip that was 1.5 inches wide by the length of the quilt block. The quilt blocks she had created were around 12.5 by 12.5 inches. So I just went through and cut out a 1.5 by 12.5 inch square. And then I am repeating this for both quilt blocks, so it'll be on the top and the bottom. Once I had those cut out, I then took my quilt block and then I just kind of pinned this in place. I did use quilting clips for this so that it would stay nice and secure. And then I just went over to my sewing machine and sewed this up. So for this, I just went through, sewed them up so that it would have a nice border. Basically what this is going to do is just give us a little bit more of a contrast so that we're not just having two quilt blocks together, but because it is that darker border, the quilt blocks will stand out a little bit more on our bag. So once I went through, sewed all of these together, it was then time to just press all of this out. Once everything was nice and flat and smooth, I then went ahead and cut out the rest of the border. So keeping with that 1.5 inch wide theme, but then doing the height of the fabric. So because we added that border on, this came to around 14 or so inches. And then I just sewed this in place as well. Again, if you are doing this yourself, you could add however big of a border you would like. You could even make this thicker or smaller. Now it is time to actually put our tote bag together. So we have our two quilt blocks with their border, and then I'm going to be cutting out two pieces for the lining. So the lining is going to be the same size as the outside portions. So you're just going to be cutting out those two squares. I'm using the same green that I used for the border. I will also be using the same green for the straps. Now for the straps, I did sort of more just go with however much fabric I had left. This ended up being around a 3 inch wide piece of material by the length of the material. And then I just acted like I was making my own bias tape and then folded, pressed this all out so there's no raw edges, and then I just took a seam on either side. So I did this for both straps, taking a seam about 1/4 inch away or so from the edge so that I could get those nice secure straps. I don't anticipating her using this for anything super heavy. I see it more maybe for holding her yarns, maybe she had some magazines. For some of her work, she does have paperwork that she carries around, so maybe that can go in this bag, so we didn't need the straps super thick. Once those were done, it was then just time to attach them to the bag. So I did around 2 inches away from the edge for both the front as well as the back. And then I did cut out some batting just so that I could have that on hand too. So you can see I have the straps in place and then I have the batting underneath, so it's the same size as the front and back. And then I just sewed the straps on. Be sure if you do this, you want the flat edge of the strap to be matching the wrong edge of your material, so that way when you kind of fold it up, you get that nice clean edge so that you don't see any of the raw edges. Now it was time to add the zipper. Now if you're familiar with my rosary pouch pattern at all, or if you've seen that video, we're following a very similar method. So we are matching the right sides of our zipper to the right sides of the quilt block, so going along at the top, just pinning this in place. And then what we're going to be doing is taking the lining of our material and now placing that with right sides together onto the wrong side of the zipper. So basically making a zipper sandwich where we have our lining, we then have our zipper, and then we have our outside of the material. and we're just going to be sewing all of these layers together so that we have everything nice and secure. So I just went through on my sewing machine, sewed all of this up. At times, if you need to adjust your zipper foot, you definitely can do that. But here is what the zipper looks like. It's nice and clean. I'm so excited with how it's turning out. So now it's just time for us to repeat these steps for the other side of the bag. So I'm just taking the second side of the bag as well as that lining and doing the exact same process. So we have our lining, and then we have our zipper, and then we have the outside of our material. So following that same sandwiching method, being sure that the wrong side of the zipper is touching the right side of the lining, and then the right side of the zipper is touching the right side of the outside of your bag. And this is going to give you just a really nice and clean effect when sewing it through. So I'm just going to sew this in place, and then once I have gone through to sew it in place, I did go ahead and top stitch everything down. And this allows your lining not to pop up, but it also just gives the bag a really nice and clean feel. So I was really happy with how it turned out. I also love the zipper and zipper pull. So this is from Zipper Valley in case you're interested, but I think she'll really like it too with the flowers. So I just went through and top stitched the second side as well. So getting as close as I can, just making sure that the lining and the outside of the bag are connected. Now we are really almost done with completing this bag, so I'm going to match the right sides of the outside of the bag together and match the right sides of the lining. And now I'm just going to go through and clip all of this up all the way around the bag. And this is going to allow us to then be able to sew it all together. The one item you do want to be careful of is for the outside of the bag, you can sew all the way around, but for the lining, you are going to want to leave a gap. So I left about a 3-inch gap on the bottom, and we're just going to be sewing from one side of those quilting clips going all the way around the bag to the second set of quilting clips and leaving that gap open. This is going to allow us to turn our bag, so when I got to any of the corners, I was be sure to pivot. And then when I got to the zipper, I was careful to be sure my machine could go over it. You want to be sure there's no metal portions there at all. If it's just like a plastic zipper, normally your machine can sew through it. And then once I got to the second set of quilting clips, I stopped, and then I took this off my machine and then I turned this right side out. Once you turn your bag right side out though, all that's really left is to sew up that hole in your lining. So at this point your bag is really close to being complete, and I did take a hand stitch for this. Now I know that I went through this process pretty quickly. This wasn't necessarily a pattern, but more just to show how I made this for my mom. While I was going through it though, I feel like this could be a really fun pattern, and we could definitely go into more detail and more steps. So let me know in the comments if that's something of interest to you. I would be happy to, maybe do a more in-depth video of all the steps that I did to make this, including the measurements, and then maybe we could even have some for the quilt blocks themselves. But here is what her bag looks like. I think it's a really fun use for her, especially since, she didn't know what to do with these, and now she has something to show off those 2 quilt blocks that she had made. To all the moms out there, happy Mother's Day. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and let me know what you want to see next. Thanks for watching.